I thought I stayed after class for extra credit, but under the soft glow of the classroom lights, every glance, every quiet word from her began to feel like something else. It wasn't just about grades anymore. It was about the one lesson she could never teach out loud. The bell had already rung, and the last traces of laughter and footsteps faded down the hallway. For a moment, the classroom felt like it was holding its breath, the scent of chalk, old paper, and faint perfume lingering in the air. Miss Carter was still at her desk, gathering assignments into neat piles, her movements precise but tired. I had offered to stay behind to help her organize the papers, partly for extra credit, partly because something about her presence drew me in, even when she said nothing at all. The evening sun streamed in through the blinds, painting long golden stripes across the desks. Dust motes drifted lazily through the light, moving to a rhythm only silence seemed to know. I stood beside her, trying not to seem too eager, stacking papers, aligning edges, feeling the weight of the quiet between us. She glanced at me once, her expression unreadable. Not cold, just distant, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. "You don't have to stay, you know," she said softly, not looking up from the papers. Her tone wasn't dismissive. It was protective, maybe even kind. "I don't mind," I said. "It's peaceful when everyone's gone." That made her smile, faint, brief, but real. "Peaceful," she echoed, as if tasting the word. "That's one way to put it." I noticed then how the lines around her eyes deepened when she smiled. Not signs of age, but of experience, of having seen too much and felt more than she probably let on. She wore her confidence like a quiet shield, but tonight there was something softer beneath it, something I couldn't quite name. We worked in silence again, the sound of papers shifting and pens clicking filling the space where small talk could have been. My hand brushed hers once as we reached for the same folder. A light, accidental touch that lingered in my nerves longer than it should have. She didn't pull away immediately. She paused, then withdrew her hand gracefully, pretending not to notice. But her eyes flickered toward me. A quick, almost imperceptible glance. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the seconds stretching like threads between us. I could feel her presence beside me. The faint warmth from her arm, the way her breathing steadied as she worked. When she finally looked up, the sunset behind her framed her face in gold, softening the sharpness of her usual composure. "You're a good student," she said quietly. "You notice things." I wasn't sure what she meant. My grades or the way I seemed to see her differently than the others did. Either way, I just nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't sound clumsy. As we finished the last stack, she exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the sound of the clock. In that moment, the classroom didn't feel like a place for lessons anymore. It felt like a shared pause between two people who weren't supposed to linger. And I realized, as the sun slipped below the horizon, that this was the first evening that would stay with me for a long time. The next evening unfolded almost the same way. The hum of conversation, the shuffle of backpacks, the echo of doors closing. Yet when the room finally emptied, something about the quiet felt expectant, as if it had been waiting for the two of us to remain. Miss Carter sat behind her desk, her glasses low on her nose as she read through essays. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes still. I hesitated at the door, unsure whether to speak or just slip away. But before I could decide, she looked up. "Staying again?" she asked, a faint curve touching her lips. "If you don't mind," I replied. "I figured you could use another set of hands." She tilted her head slightly, considering me for a moment before nodding. "I won't say no to help." I took a seat beside her, spreading the stack of ungraded papers across the desk. The faint scent of her perfume, something subtle and clean, like white lilies after rain, drifted through the air. It was impossible not to notice, yet I forced myself to keep my focus on the pages in front of me. After a while, she spoke again. "You ever wonder what it's all for?" I looked up. "The class." She smiled faintly. "Teaching. The long hours, the endless essays. Some days I think I'm just talking into an empty room." There was no bitterness in her tone, just quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes from caring too deeply for too long. I wanted to tell her that she wasn't invisible, that I noticed the way she gave each student more than they ever realized, but the words felt too heavy to release. Instead, I said, "You make it matter." She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity. Then, after a pause, she nodded. "That's kind of you to say." We talked then, not about the class, but about music, about the places she used to visit when she was my age, about how different the world felt before everything moved so fast. Her voice softened as she spoke, and I could hear in it traces of the woman she used to be before she became everyone's teacher. When she leaned over my shoulder to look at an essay, her hand rested on the desk beside mine. The warmth of her skin seemed to hum against the air. Her hair brushed lightly against my cheek. A feather touch, accidental, but enough to make my breath hitch. She didn't move away immediately, as if neither of us wanted to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled between us. The clock read 6:45 when she finally pulled back. "We should call it a day," she said quietly, though her voice carried a note of hesitation. I gathered my things, but before leaving, I glanced back. She was watching the window, lost in thought, her reflection bathed in soft, amber light, and I realized this wasn't just another after-hours session. It was the beginning of something she couldn't teach, and I was only starting to understand. The third evening came without a plan. I hadn't meant to stay late again, but somehow, when the classroom emptied, my feet didn't move toward the door. Miss Carter didn't seem surprised when she noticed me still there. If anything, her expression softened, as if she'd been expecting it. Outside, dusk settled earlier that day, the sky bruised with clouds. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast a quiet halo across her desk, and the rhythmic scratch of her pen filled the silence. I offered to help, but she shook her head gently. "Just keep me company if you don't mind," she said, her voice low, as though she didn't trust the walls not to listen. So I sat across from her, watching the light play across her features. The faint curve of her smile, the glint of her wedding band, dulled with time. I wondered who she was outside of this room. Did someone wait for her at home? Did anyone notice when she didn't smile all the way to her eyes? After a while, she spoke again, her eyes still fixed on the papers. "Do you ever feel like you're moving too fast?" she asked. "Like life's racing ahead, and you're just trying to catch up?" I thought about my answer before speaking. Every day. But I think it's worse when you stop moving, when you realize you don't even know where you're running to. She finally looked up, and for a second, her guarded composure slipped. There was vulnerability there, faint but real. "You're too young to understand that kind of exhaustion," she murmured, half smiling. "Maybe," I said, "but I see it." That made her pause. Her gaze held mine a heartbeat too long, something wordless passing between us. Then she laughed softly, trying to shake it off. "You notice too much," she said, echoing her words from before. "Maybe that's how I learn best," I replied. The moment felt suspended. Not flirtation, not confession, but an understanding neither of us could comfortably name. When she reached for another stack of papers, one slipped to the floor. I bent to pick it up at the same time she did. Our hands brushed, her fingers cool against my skin, the contact quick but charged. She froze, her breath catching just slightly, and I could feel the pulse beneath her wrist. "Sorry," I whispered. She shook her head slowly. "Don't be." But her tone carried something else. A quiet tremor, the sound of someone realizing a line had been crossed, even if only by accident. We went back to our work, but it wasn't the same. Every small sound, the turning of a page, the clink of a pen, the shifting of a chair, felt amplified by the tension that hung in the air. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. "You don't have to keep staying after class," she said softly. "I know," I replied, "but I don't want to stop." Her expression faltered, a mix of warmth and fear, and she looked away before whispering, "Be careful with that kind of honesty." The door closed behind me, but her words stayed, echoing like the faint hum of the lights in the empty hallway, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next few days blurred into each other, lectures, hall noise, the familiar scrape of chairs on tile. But every evening, when the classroom emptied, that same quiet tension seemed to draw us back to the same place, as if gravity itself wanted us to stay. It wasn't planned anymore. It was just understood. I'd linger, pretending to finish an assignment. She'd tidy up the desk, moving slower than necessary. There was always something left undone, a reason to stay a little longer. That evening, the sky outside was painted in shades of violet and gold. The windows reflected the soft light of the setting sun, turning the empty classroom into something almost tender. Miss Carter was at the cabinet sorting through exam folders. Her blouse sleeves were rolled to her elbows, her hair pinned loosely, strands escaping and catching the light whenever she moved. "Could you hand me that binder?" she asked, nodding toward the top shelf. I reached for it, but as I pulled it down, a loose folder slipped from between the binders and fluttered to the floor. We both knelt to pick it up, papers scattering like startled birds across the linoleum. Our hands met, not brushed but met, full, steady contact for a single suspended heartbeat. Her fingers were cool at first, then warm against mine. Neither of us moved. The silence between us deepened, filled with the sound of our breaths and the faint hum of the air vent. When she finally looked up, her eyes weren't the calm, composed ones I knew. They were softer, uncertain, as if she were seeing me for the first time and didn't know what to do with that realization. "I'm sorry," she murmured, pulling her hand back, but I shook my head. "Don't be." Her lips parted, maybe to answer, maybe to deflect, but no words came. She stood slowly, brushing the papers together, her movements suddenly deliberate, almost careful. When she handed me the stack, her fingers trembled just slightly. The light above us flickered, dimming to a low amber glow. Shadows stretched across the desks, long and fragile. For a moment, it didn't feel like a classroom at all. More like a quiet corner of the world that existed only for the two of us. She set the papers aside and leaned back against the edge of the desk. "This isn't what I meant when I said, 'Stay after hours,'" she said softly, a faint smile curving her lips. It wasn't teasing, more a way of acknowledging the obvious, the unspoken current that had been building between us. I smiled back, unsure of what to say, but the silence was enough. When she finally stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth from her presence, she rested a hand on my arm. Not in invitation, not in affection, but in trust. Her touch was steady, quiet, real. "Let's keep this simple," she said after a pause. "We're just two people who stayed a little too long." I nodded, though we both knew it wasn't simple anymore. When she turned away, I could still feel the imprint of her touch, light, lingering, and impossible to forget. The rain began that evening before I even reached her classroom. A soft, steady drizzle that made the hallways smell like wet paper and old wood. Most teachers had already gone home, but Miss Carter's door was still open, a warm rectangle of light in the dim corridor. She looked up when I entered. "You again," she said with a small smile, not surprised. "You must really need that extra credit." "Maybe I just like the quiet," I said, shaking the rain from my hair. She studied me for a moment, then gestured toward the doorway. "Come on," she said, grabbing her cardigan from the back of her chair. "Let's take a break from the papers tonight. Coffee?" The invitation was casual, but something in her tone felt like an offering, not of caffeine, but of company. I followed her to the staff lounge, where the only light came from a vending machine humming in the corner. The air was heavy with the scent of instant coffee and faint traces of chalk dust clinging to her sleeves. She poured hot water into 2 paper cups, stirred in powdered cream, and handed one to me. Our fingers brushed briefly against the cardboard, that same quiet spark leaping across the small distance. We sat side by side at the counter, steam curling from the cups, the hum of rain muffling the silence outside. "You ever wonder," she began, staring into her coffee, "what happens when you stop being the person people expect you to be?" I looked at her, unsure how to answer. Her voice was steady, but her hands were wrapped tightly around the cup. "I used to love this job," she continued. Every day felt like it meant something. But lately, she trailed off, exhaling a soft laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Lately, it's like I'm fading out of my own story. I watched her for a moment, the weight of her honesty pressing against the small space between us. You're not fading, I said quietly. You're the only person in this building who still looks alive when everyone else is running on autopilot. She looked up then, and for the first time, there was no guard in her expression. Only a quiet ache, deep and human. Her eyes glistened faintly in the dim light. Don't say things like that, she whispered, but her voice trembled. Why not? I asked softly. Because I might believe you. The words hung there, fragile as breath. Then she laughed gently, wiping at her eyes. You have a dangerous way of noticing people, she said. Maybe people need to be noticed sometimes, I replied. She reached across the counter, her hand finding mine. It was a small, hesitant gesture, her thumb resting lightly over my knuckles, but it carried more warmth than the coffee between us. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. When she finally pulled her hand back, her voice was quieter. Thank you, she said, for reminding me I'm still here. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper. Inside, the silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was gentle, steady, and strangely full. I didn't know what this was becoming, but I knew it was real, and that was enough for now. The rain hadn't stopped the next evening. It came down in soft, silvery sheets that made the campus shimmer under the streetlights. I almost didn't go back. Part of me knew that each after-hours visit was pulling us into a space we couldn't easily step back from. But something about that small, quiet room, and her, kept calling me back. When I walked in, she was standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the rain trail down the glass. Her hair was loosely tied, and the soft light from the desk lamp turned her profile into a painting, elegant, tired, beautiful in the kind of way that had nothing to do with appearance. You shouldn't be out in this weather, she said without turning. I didn't mind, I replied, setting my bag down. Besides, I figured you'd still be here. That made her glance over her shoulder, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You figured right. The air between us was different that night. Quieter, heavier. Like the world outside had blurred away and left only the sound of rain and the faint hum of fluorescent light. She moved back to her desk, flipping through papers that didn't really need sorting. I could tell she was buying time, steadying herself. You've done enough, you know, she said finally. You've already earned your extra credit. Twice over, probably. I'm not staying for that anymore, I said, my voice low but steady. She froze, her hand resting on the stack of papers. When she looked up, her eyes searched mine. Not for an answer, but for a reason to believe it. Then why are you staying? She asked, her tone barely above a whisper. I swallowed. Because I like the way this place feels when it's quiet. Because it feels honest here. Because... I paused, unsure if I should finish. Because I like being around you. The clock ticked in the silence that followed, slow, deliberate. She didn't speak right away. Her gaze dropped to the papers, then to her hands, as though she needed something to hold on to. You don't know what you're saying, she said softly. You'll look back and see how complicated this is. Maybe, I said, but I know it doesn't feel wrong. Her breath caught, a barely audible sound, fragile as the rain outside. She turned slightly, facing me now, her eyes reflecting the low golden light. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she sighed, a long, quiet surrender. You make it very hard to keep pretending this is just extra credit, she said, her smile faint but full of ache. I took a step closer, not touching, just near enough to feel her presence. Then maybe stop pretending, I said. Her shoulders relaxed, just barely. She looked down, then up again, meeting my gaze with something like peace. Stay, she whispered. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even an invitation. It was an admission that we were already past the point of pretending. And when I said, I wasn't planning on leaving, she closed her eyes briefly, as if letting the truth finally settle between us. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air washed clean and cool. That evening, the campus felt hushed, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm. I walked into the classroom as I always did, expecting the same soft glow, the same quiet rhythm we'd somehow built together. But there was something different in the air, a calmness that carried the weight of a decision already made. Miss Carter was at her desk, packing the last of her papers into a worn leather satchel. The blinds were half open, letting in streaks of pale orange light from the sunset. When she looked up and saw me standing there, she smiled. Not the guarded, polite smile I'd seen before, but one filled with something gentler. "You came," she said softly. "I said I would," I replied. She nodded, setting the satchel down. "I was hoping you would." For a moment, we stood there in the stillness. Two people surrounded by the faint smell of chalk and rain-soaked earth, both knowing the end had already arrived. "I think this should be our last late evening," she said finally, her voice steady but kind. "We've both been staying a little too long." I felt the words sink in before I could answer. "Because it's wrong?" Her gaze met mine, clear, unflinching. "Because it's beautiful. And beautiful things don't always survive when the world sees them." I didn't argue. There was nothing to say. The truth sat between us, fragile and pure. She walked around the desk and stopped a few feet away from me. The light caught in her hair, the faintest smile still playing at her lips. "You've been good company," she said, her voice quiet but full. "More than you know. And you've been more than a teacher," I said. "You've been someone I'll remember." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the silence became something sacred. She stepped closer, slowly, carefully, until she stood within arm's reach. Then, with a kind of hesitance that only comes from deep feeling, she reached up and brushed a damp strand of hair from my forehead. Her fingertips lingered warm, trembling slightly. The touch wasn't bold or romantic. It was an act of tenderness, of goodbye disguised as comfort. "Thank you," she whispered, "for reminding me what it feels like to be seen." I took her hand before she could lower it, holding it gently between mine. Her pulse was steady, her skin soft, the faint scent of her perfume familiar now, like the end of a song you don't want to stop hearing. "Thank you," I said, "for everything you didn't mean to teach me." Her smile deepened, a little sad but peaceful. She squeezed my hand once, then let go. The clock ticked softly as she walked me to the door. The hallway beyond was quiet, washed in golden light. When she opened the door, the scent of rain drifted in again. "Good night," she said. "Goodbye," I answered. But as I walked down the empty corridor, I realized that not every goodbye feels like an ending. Some linger, soft and lasting, like chalk dust on your hands long after you've left the room. And in my heart, her voice echoed. Some lessons stay with you forever. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that quiet ache between them, that warmth hidden in the silence, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts below. Tell me, have you ever met someone who changed you in ways they never meant to? Subscribe for more slow burn, heartfelt stories like this, stories that remind us love isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's just two people who stayed a little too long.